In 2018, Oxfam conducted a human rights impact assessment into the Italian processed tomato supply chain of S Group, the biggest Finnish food retailer, and their procurement arm, SOC Corporation. Our objectives were to identify actual and potential human rights impact at the production stage of the supply chain and their root causes. We focused the assessment on two of the biggest and long-standing suppliers to SOC Corporation, the Italian companies Ladoria and Mutti, and their sourcing in the region around Foggia, in Puglia, in the south of Italy. This is the region in which many reports have documented serious human and labor rights violations in the tomato sector. They included forced labor, low wages below the rates negotiating in the relevant collective agreement, excessive working hours, unsafe transport, and unsafe and sanitary accommodation that lacks basic services like running water and electricity.
In order to assess the severity of the human rights impacts that we identified, we used a simple table in which we considered each initially against three factors. Firstly, the scale of the impact, or how grave its consequences. Secondly, the scope of the impact, or how many people would be affected by it. And thirdly, the remediability of the impact, or the extent to which it is possible to restore the situation for rights holders. We used a simple three-part scale to assess the identified impacts against each of these factors. For example, we assessed whether the scale of the impact was major, minor, or moderate, and whether the remediation would be possible, not possible, or likely. Breaking the severity question down in this way helped us to differentiate between the multiple factors we'd identified. For example, we assessed excessive working hours to be an impact of major scale, given that excessive working hours in the heat of the Italian sun has been linked to the deaths of workers in the field. Of major scope, given that it would affect the majority of workers in the sector, and one for which remediation is possible for all current workers, but not possible for those who have already suffered loss of life or severe health impacts. By contrast, restrictions of freedom of association were considered to be moderate impact of medium scope in which remediation would be possible.
So in order to prioritise recommended actions for SOK Corporation, in addition to our assessment of the likelihood and severity of the impacts which we identified, we also considered the company's contribution to those impacts and their leverage to address them. Again, we used a simple three-part scale to do that. So we judged whether or not the company contributed to, caused, or was directly linked to the impact, and whether their leverage could be considered low, moderate, or high. And to make these judgments, critically, we made use of a root cause analysis as a key part of our methodology. Now, to do that, we needed a different analytical toolkit to many of the other parts of the human rights impact assessment. We made use of a political economy approach, which investigates the systemic drivers of human rights impacts as opposed to the actions of any individual actors. And we distinguished between two different kinds of root causes, those which are connected to the supply of labour in Italy, which is acutely vulnerable to exploitation. And these tend to be things like the lack of formal recruitment channels for farmers in the south of Italy, or the presence of criminal networks, for example. These are things which, over which companies at the other end of the supply chain, like SOK Corporation, tend to have very little, if any, influence. And secondly, we identified root causes connected to the demand for cheap labour in Italy. And this we traced to the demand for cheap tomatoes and the bargaining power of powerful retailers to drive down prices in the supply chain. Now, we found, for example, that SOK Corporation's price that they paid to their first-tier suppliers in Italy had declined between 15 and 25% in real terms in just the last 5 years. And this, we concluded, was adding pressure to farmers who already have tight margins and giving them an incentive to further cut labour costs. And that we concluded was part of the picture that suggested that the company is contributing to the risk of human rights, labour rights abuses in the sector. And it's only with this analysis of the root causes that we were able to reach final conclusions about how to prioritise recommendations by looking at the severity, the likelihood, the contribution of the company and their leverage. That's how we arrived at our final conclusions about the prioritised actions that SOK Corporation should take.